Hello, my name is Dimitri, and as he already said, I work in Nodus Labs, which is a research organization that studies how the framework of networks can be used to understand cognition and social processes. First of all, I'll just say what I'm going to do. I'll just make like a half-an-hour-long presentation of some of the main ideas in the network analysis that can be used to understand protest movements. And because there's not so much time, if you have any questions, we either can have them after the session or outside during the breaks and so on. So I'm very open to speak about it after. And the second thing is that I just want to address the context where this talk is actually happening. It's the Revolt track, and most of the discussions in this track are focusing on protest movements. And somehow we all share a similar understanding of what a protest movement is. It's when a group of people shares a certain idea, becomes fascinated with it strongly enough that they unify for a collective action in order to spread this idea to the rest of the people who might not always be sharing the same values. And we've seen it happening during the last years in the Occupy Wall Street movement, in the protests in Africa, in Russia, and so on. And sometimes it worked well, and sometimes it didn't. We also know that social media plays an important role in this process. We also know that the governments, they started to also do some kind of crackdown on the freedom of the internet in order to stop these movements, and sometimes even use the same techniques in order to counteract protest movements. So we kind of know what's happening in the field generally. But what I want to speak about today, and it's something that I feel is often missing from this discourse, are the technicalities of how protest movements actually work and function. How does it happen that people get into a certain idea at the same time? How do they unify for a collective action? How can we ensure that a message spreads through network in the most efficient way to a large group of people? How can we structure our interactions in the ways that would enable the network be robust against external influence and at the same time open and adaptable enough so that it could be responsive to whatever challenges it encounters in the outside world? And all these questions are very complex because we're dealing with a lot of individuals that interact. And the framework of network analysis can be very useful to think about this phenomena. So in network analysis, the people are represented as nodes, and their interactions are the connections between them. Once we start seeing communities as networks, we can use various tools from graph analysis and mathematics in order to see how these communities come together, proliferate information, and fall apart. And one of the basic models that's used when we talk about information contagion and dissemination of information in networks are the epidemic models, which are usually used to study diseases. I'll just go through them quickly because we don't have so much time. One of the basic ones is SIR, so that means that the node can be in several different stages. It can be susceptible, S, I, infected, and R, recovered. Or a more complex version of the same model is susceptible, infected, recovered, susceptible again, back to infected. So these very basic epidemic models can then be applied to any dynamics that involves people getting into a certain idea. So for example, they can be susceptible to something, let's say like buying new Nike sneakers or something like this, then become infected with the idea, so they buy them, then the fashion wears off, they recover, then the new fashion comes again, they go back to being infected with a certain idea. So this is a basic epidemic model, how it works. And then one other important concept here are information cascades. It's herd-like behavior influenced by the others. when the conversion threshold is exceeded. So let's say that the node is you, and this is all the friends or family that you have. A certain time passes by, and a small proportion of your surrounding becomes interested in a certain idea. Let's say they think that the government system in Germany sucks and they want to change it. So they will tell you that, okay, something has to be done. But because it's only, let's say, 10% of the people that surround you, it's not enough for you to change the opinion. So some time passes, even more, and you have already 70% of your surrounding interested in the same idea or maybe believing in a certain thing or adopting a certain trend. So you become much more susceptible to accepting it also because of the social pressure, because you hear it all the time, and so on. So at some point, you also become infected with a certain idea that is surrounding you. So this is a basic model of how informational cascades work. So on the global level, this is how the contagion occurs. I don't know if I can play this video here. No. We have different groups inside the networks that are susceptible to a certain piece of information. They become infected, then they spread information further to other groups. Some of the groups recover during the process, and this kind of dynamics happens globally. When we model interaction processes in this way, then we can use the tools from graph analysis, also differential equations, to see how exactly does it happen that information spreads through networks, what network structures are the most conducive to spread information, what network structures are better to make sure that information spreads simultaneously in a synchronized way, and so on. So I'll just go quickly through the different types of networks that exist. So one of the most common one is scale-free network. It's when most of the nodes inside the network have very few connections, and a few but significant number of nodes are very well connected. So the number of connections among the nodes is distributed unequally. They have a very varying degree of the influence that they have in the network. Internet is structured, for example, like this. You have websites like Twitter and Google and Facebook where most of the people go, and most of the websites on the internet are maybe only visited by the people who actually created them. So this is scale-free network structure. Then we have another type of network, random network. It's where most of the nodes have more or less the same number of connections, and there is a few deviations. Very few nodes are very well connected, and very few nodes have very few connections. But most of the nodes, they share more or less the same number of connections. This is a situation that you normally encounter at your workplace or in a university where everyone knows each other, so everyone has more or less the same number of connections in the group. And then we have also small world networks, which are very typical for whatever social structures we're involved in, our friends, family, and so on. So this means that we still have a very well-connected network, almost as well connected as the random network, but the community structure inside the network is quite prominent. So we have different groups of nodes which are more densely connected together than with the rest of the network. So we have all these different communities that interact together globally as well. This is a very typical structure for normal social networks that we have. Your friends, maybe your family, it's all the different groups that have weak ties together and form different communities. So when we talk about dissemination of information in networks, the structure of the network is very important, because a few different independent researchers, both in epidemics and in viral marketing, they found out that, for example, if we talk about random network where most of the people know each other and a certain disease or information enters this network, it's much more susceptible to high amplitude oscillations. So the lifetime of infection is short-lived, but at the same time, such random networks are much more likely to synchronize globally. So basically, if you have a group of people where everyone knows each other and everyone interacts all the time, and you communicate a certain message to a large enough proportion that informational cascades occur, then you will ensure that there is certain trends happening in the network, that a lot of people become interested in the same idea at the same time. However, it will be quite short-lived, so it will be a short-lived trend that disappears after a while. On the other extreme, we have also networks that are more like scale-free with a prominent community structure. Such networks are very good in proliferating information for longer distances, so you ensure that almost everyone in the network receives the message, but they're much less likely to synchronize. So the global cascades are much less likely to occur. And then we have something in the middle, which is mostly the case of scale-free networks, where there's different prominent communities that are also connected together through random shortcuts. Such networks can synchronize easily, and at the same time, they can also proliferate information globally very efficiently. So when we talk about disseminating information in networks, the introduction of random shortcuts in the community structure that's quite distinct is very important. And this enables the network to maintain the capacity to synchronize globally, but at the same time to also have enough resistance against this kind of oscillatory movement, where it can change opinion very quickly or where a certain piece of information or a trend can wear off. So introducing random shortcuts in the community structure is very important for actually disseminating information in networks. Then we have also another important point. It's the existence of the giant component. So most of the nodes in the network should belong to the same interconnected structure. A very good example is, for example, right now here, I don't know how many people know each other, but after we finish this talk, if you all knew each other and you were interacting with each other, it would be much easier to continue this discussion in this group. However, because everyone is more or less disconnected, it makes it very difficult for this network that we also temporarily formed here to actually generate some information on its own. It always needs external input and impulse in order to kind of get involved into certain things. So when you communicate information to large groups of people, it's important to make sure first that they are interconnected so that they have the actual capacity to interact together. And then it will make it much easier for you to communicate a certain message to this group of people. And what happens on Facebook quite often with pages that are established for brands or for protest movements is that lots of people that belong to the page or that belong to the group are actually not connected to each other. So they don't have their friends belonging to the same group. That means that you communicate a certain message to them, but they don't spread it on their own. So they always need external input in order to continue acting within the constellation. So forming giant component and connections between the nodes is very important for information to spread through. Then also, one other important thing is when we communicate to a large group of people, it's important to start with the group of interconnected nodes. And then this group will spread the information to the rest of the network through the connections that it has to other groups. At the same time, this also tells us what the possible strategy of resistance could be if we have a network that we don't want to be influenced too easily. So in this case, studies in epidemiology, they found that the least efficient immunization strategy was to immunize a certain proportion of groups in the population. So, for example, the households. And the most efficient immunization strategy was to immunize a certain proportion within each group. So that means that if we want to be able to resist being influenced easily, the network that we're operating, it should be comprised of groups that don't share the same opinion. So there is maybe some confrontation even within the groups. That means they cannot easily synchronize together, and that means they wouldn't also spread information globally. So these are the two extremes that we can have. On one side, groups that share a certain consensus, and that makes it easy to communicate certain piece of information to them that they spread it further in the network. And on another side, as a strategy of resistance, to have groups that slightly disagree, so it makes it harder for them to synchronize globally. So basically what I want to emphasize here is that if we are talking about a group of people which is able to unify for a collective action and share the same idea of a certain thing, it's important that every member of this group acts on the basis of polysingularity, where they belong simultaneously to different communities that are distinct from each other, that don't relate together, but that enables them to have a multiplicity of different opinions and to choose at each time which group they belong to, and at the same time be open to any other information from other groups. Another important idea when we spread information is to focus on brokers, on the people that connect different groups together, because then they will disseminate information through the rest of the network. And of course, the message itself, it should be structured like a virus, so it should have the capacity to replicate itself. And there was a very interesting study done of London riots by The Guardian, where they found that the rumors that started with a question were much longer lived than the rumors that started with a certain assertion. So for example, if you want to spread a rumor, it's much easier if you say not just like Angela Merkel disappeared, but you write, is it true that Bild wrote that Angela Merkel disappeared? So you start with the question, and there's a lot of layers of truths that have to be actually unfolded in order to get to the core of the message and to confirm it or not. So starting with the question is always good to make sure that information goes viral. It's also important to recontextualize, so to know the kind of mental map of the group that you address, so you can propose something that relates to the information they already have, but that still also carries some kind of novelty in this message. And of course, it's important that the purpose of the group is related to the message that you communicate. So it should reiterate the purpose that brings people together. If you try to communicate to the group that's against Putin that animal rights are important, it's not going to work so well. But if you say that they should believe in the fact that animal rights are important because it will help to put Putin down, maybe it will work better. So there should be always connection to the purpose that holds the group together. And one other important study found that once 10% of people is committed enough to a certain idea, they can spread it easily through the rest of the network. Then I'll just go quickly in a couple of minutes, and then I will be done through the Russian protest movement. We analyzed different Facebook groups that were established to actually be able to do this protest that happened in December and January in Moscow. And one of the groups was Putin Must Leave. We found that we analyzed it actually once in December and once in January 2012 after a big demonstration that happened in Moscow. And we found that while the group was able to attract new members, the community structure inside the group didn't change. And also the communities were not very well connected together. More than half of the nodes didn't have any friends that belonged to the same network. So it made it very hard for this network to actually introduce any change because it was not connected enough and it was not open enough to external challenges that it faced. And also when we analyzed which people actually belonged to each group, we found that it was a highly politicized group that consisted of people who worked with opposition leaders. There's a group here where it's Georgian activists who are against Putin because of that war that happened before. So it was a highly politicized group with a lot of ideology inside. On the other hand, another group that worked in a much more efficient way and that was much more successful in implementing change was the volunteer and activist group that was just gathering people to be observers at the next presidential elections. Over the same period of time, this group managed to attract 50% more members. So it rose almost twice, and then the members that were already part of the network, they actually connected together much more. It had much less nodes that didn't have any other friends in the network, so only 1/3 of the people didn't know anyone else, but 2/3 were actually connected to each other in the network. And this group was much more interconnected. It had lower average path, the distance you have to travel in between the nodes. And the communities, actually, what was most interesting, they changed the structure. So the hubs, which were important, they lost their importance and they gave way to the newcomers from the periphery who were able to actually also influence the kind of processes that happen within the group. And when we analyzed who are the members of this network, we found that it was mainly journalists and bloggers who were not politically active before. So this group that was formed for a very practical purpose was much more efficient in evolving in something that could be useful and that actually worked much better. And now that we look in retrospective, the political change didn't really happen, but what happened is that people, they, for the first time in Russia, got a taste for actually actively participating in very practical and important processes of election, of observing election, and of being active in this field. So successful groups are the ones where people talk to each other, where the periphery is integrated, where hubs are leaving the center to form new groups, when small number of orphans or people who are not connected exist, and when the unifying slogan is not something political and general and abstract, but more a call to action. Then people are constantly reminded about the purpose that brings them together. So just to go through quickly the main points that I made in this presentation, it's important for information dissemination that there is a prominent community structure that has random shortcuts in between the communities. It's important to focus on densely connected homogeneous group in order to spread information. Information brokers are important because they connect different communities together so they can be addressed in order to proliferate information inside the network, and message should be structured as a virus in order to be able to replicate itself. Of course, I looked into all these details from the point of view of how to make it easy for information to spread through, but we can use exactly the same strategies to also be able to resist any external influence that might be encountered through social networks. And for example, the way how Facebook makes people interact, where it locks people into informational bubbles, where we are surrounded by quite homogeneous community, actually makes it much easier for external agents to influence people and influence the behavior. So it's always important to resist, I think, this kind of drive that exists in society right now to filter out your circle of communication to one group, but to always still be able to go into different groups and be part of different communities, maybe even have different lives, and that would enable you to have an overview of what's happening on a global scale, while also being able to be active in a certain field as long as you feel it's important. So these are my contact details. If you want to speak about it after, you're very welcome to send me an email, but we can also speak after, or if you have some questions right now, I think I have maybe a few minutes, you're very welcome to ask them. Thank you.